Okay, second hour, we've been doing the biblical covenants, and we're going to look at part 2 of the Davidic covenant. We actually looked at the Davidic covenant itself last week in 2 Samuel chapter 7. What we're going to look at this week is several psalms, and there's more than what we're going to look at. We're going to look at only 3, but there's several that refer to the king, and even the one that Matt read for us this morning in Psalm 72, you can tell it was a psalm written by Solomon. I think he's actually praying for himself there as the Davidic king. He's praying God's blessing upon him as the Davidic king. And he recognizes, based on the covenant back in 2 Samuel 7, that he's really God's regent on the earth. He's the means by which God is fulfilling his promises to the people of Israel. And he's the leader. He's the head guy. Now, it becomes clear as you read through the entire Old Testament that none of the Davidic kings really were living the way or leading the people in the way that God wanted them to. And that's why, we'll talk about this as we go through this morning, they were looking for somebody else in the future, especially as you get to the last part of the Old Testament and the latter prophets. They're looking for this Davidic king that will fulfill the ideals that are talked about in Psalm 72. We're going to be looking this morning I'm going to be quoting from Dr. Michael Grassani quite a bit. Matt and I both had him as a seminary professor as well, and he was the one that wrote the article in the journal where they addressed all the covenants. He's the one that did the Davidic covenant. This is a quote from him, and this is really talking about, again, how, and we've talked about this, how all the covenants work together to unfold the plan of God. The provisions of the Davidic covenant represent part of the plan God has for his creation. As God set forth the various biblical covenants, each one represented a step forward in the revelation of God's intentions for the world. So I hope that's become clear as we've been looking at these covenants. We're looking at one after the other. They work together to unfold the plan of God. Again, not just for the restoration of Israel, but as we saw in the Abrahamic covenant, a blessing to all the families of the earth. Israel's just the instrument for that. Rather than operating in distinct orbits or realms, each covenant builds on the preceding covenant or covenants. Each covenant introduces new elements to God's revelation of his plan, and those elements become part of the multifaceted tapestry of biblical covenants. So we've already looked at the Abrahamic covenant, the Mosaic covenant, the priestly covenant, and then the book of Deuteronomy as a renewal of the Mosaic covenant. The Davidic covenant is another step in that program, and again we'll see how the Davidic covenant relates to those other covenants. Let's review the Davidic covenant a little bit from what we talked about last week. God promised to make a great name for David, and under his leadership to provide a secure place for the nation of Israel to dwell. Remember, that promise of land had already been given as early as the Abrahamic covenant. It's talked about a lot in the Mosaic covenant, and the blessings that are associated with the land if they're obedient to God's commands. The curses being also associated with the land, and the ultimate curse being driven out of the land. So again, you already see those covenants working together there. And the Davidic covenant, as the leader of the nation, David was going to help establish peace in the land. So, a secure place for the nation of Israel to dwell in accordance with the original promises of the Abrahamic covenant. Yahweh also promised that a descendant of David would build the temple that David himself had wanted to build, and that David's dynasty would endure forever. Remember the interplay there of words. David wanted to build a house for the Lord because he'd already built a very fine house for himself, and the Ark of the Covenant was still dwelling in a tent. So God said, no, you're not the one to do that for me. Your son will do it, but I'm going to build a house for you. And the house there is not a physical structure. It's a lineage. It's a descendancy of kings from David.
I got a question for you.
Sure.
At this point, is it looking like the state of Israel, is it like developed? Are they all still living in tents? What kind of setting is it?
Okay, it's a good question. We talked about this some last week, the fact that In Deuteronomy, they're right up to the brink of the promised land, and Moses has one last chance to exhort them to keep covenant with God. He spells out the law and expounds on the law. The Davidic covenant is about 400 years later. They're already in the land of Israel. It's after the time of the judges. They had asked for a king to rule over them like all the other nations. So it is developed in the sense that they're living in the land. And, on the one hand, God was disappointed that they were wanting a human king because he was their king. And they didn't really need a king like all the other nations. He could lead them into battle. But he granted their request, and in fact, a kingdom was evidently early on part of his plan. Even in the promises to Abraham, he told him that kings would come forth from him. And we saw in the book of Deuteronomy that things were laid out that the king was responsible to do, even before they had a king. So, yes, this is some time along in the development of the nation of Israel. As you read the rest of the Old Testament, you're going to see further development, particularly now that they have this king. The essence of the covenant, if you were to summarize what the promise is that David would never lack a man to sit upon God's throne in Jerusalem. So there's a guarantee of that line. Now, the throne itself, as we said, ceased to exist at a certain point in Israel's history, but the line continued even on down through the intertestamental period and all the way down to the time of Christ. We looked at those scriptures last week that have that summary promise of David never lacking a man to sit upon the throne. I was, in my own Bible reading, in 2 Chronicles, I came across this passage that I want to read this morning. This is in 2 Chronicles 7. So the setting here is after the completion of the temple. Solomon has prayed and they've dedicated the temple. And there's another mention here of the Davidic covenant. This is 2 Chronicles chapter 7. And he says, beginning in verse 16, this is the Lord speaking. For now I have chosen and consecrated this house that my name may be there forever, and my eyes and my heart will be there perpetually. Talking about the temple. And as for you, speaking to Solomon here, if you walk before me as your father David walked, even to do according to all that I commanded you, and will keep my statutes and my ordinances, then I will establish your royal throne as I covenanted with your father David, saying, you shall not lack a man to be ruler in Israel. Now that sounds like a very conditional promise, right? If you're obedient to me and if you keep my commands, then I'll establish your throne forever. How do we square that with the unconditional side? And what about if they don't keep the commandments? What's going to happen to them? Then? In other words, if they're not faithful, and if David's sons are not faithful to walk in the commandments of the Lord, is there a threat that their kingdom won't endure forever? What do you think?
There was the threat of exile, so there was at least threat of a temporary break in it, even if promise would endure.
Exactly. And that's what's spelled out here in the verses that remain. But if you turn away, and by implication, if your sons turn away and forsake my statutes and my commandments which I have set before you, and shall go and serve other gods and worship them, there's the if statement again. It doesn't say following that, you don't get to be king anymore, your sons don't get to be king anymore. What it says is, I will uproot you from my land which I have given you, and this house which I have consecrated for my name I will cast out of my sight, and I will make it a proverb and a byword among all peoples. Now, where have we heard that before? Deuteronomy, and even earlier than Leviticus 26. So the thing that I want you to see is, as you continue reading through the Old Testament, there's reflections back on these promises, both the promises and the threats. The threats for disobedience is exile from the land, as Matt said, a break in the kingdom itself, but there is certainty that the line itself won't be extinguished. You see that as you run through the Old Testament too. There's times where it looks like the line is threatened, but there's preservation by God. And the line continues on all the way down to Christ. All right. This is from the same article by Dr. Casani. God's establishment is I'm sorry, I went the wrong way on that. Did I? No. God's establishment of his covenant with David represents one of the theological high points of the Old Testament scriptures. This key event builds on the preceding covenants and looks forward to the ultimate establishment of God's reign on the earth. That's very important. That's the essence of that's the important aspect of the Davidic covenant, is the establishment of God's reign on the earth. This is not just a human reign. It's exercised through human beings. Christ himself is a human being. But it's truly God's reign on the earth. The psalmist and prophets provide additional details concerning the ideal Davidite who will lead God's chosen nation in righteousness. Of course, the New Testament applies various Old Testament texts about this Davidite to Jesus Christ. In the book of Revelation, John addresses him as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. What I think is important to realize is that as you're reading in the Old Testament, the expectation of the people in that day was, okay, maybe this new king that's coming to the throne, he's going to be the one. They didn't see this as some distant thing that we can see easily enough from our perspective in history. They expected each king, as he came through the line of David, to fulfill what God wanted him to be, as a righteous king who led the nation in keeping the law. And the Psalms reflect that, especially. I think the psalm that we read this morning reflected that. He's asking that God give him wisdom as he leads the nation, that God bless the nation through him and through his reign. And of course, that blessing would only come as the people were obedient to the stipulations of the covenant. So these royal psalms, and I think this is a pretty exhaustive list of all of the royal psalms. These are psalms that have to do with the reign of the Davidic king and the way that God uses that to rule over the nations. They draw heavily on the idea of a Davidic dynasty and presuppose the covenant that we've looked at already that God established with David in 2 Samuel 7. They focus on a Davidic figure who, as Yahweh's son, as again, that was an important part of what we looked at last week. It's what shows up, particularly in Psalm 2. That indicates the kind of relationship that this king has with God. It's an intimate father-son relationship. And the father, when the son sins, disciplines him, but he doesn't forsake him. So this is Yahweh's son who lived in Zion. He ruled over God's people, and he was heir to the divine promise. Psalm 2 is one such psalm, and it contrasts the hostility of the nations directed at the Lord and his Messiah, his anointed one, his king. That's what Messiah means. It's anointed one, and that just refers to the process that they went through as a new king came to the throne. You read about different kings being anointed in the Old Testament. The word Christ is that same word. I mean, it means the same thing. It means anointed one in Greek. So Messiah is the Hebrew transliteration for anointed one. Christ is the Greek. So this is God's answer to these nations that are raging against him and against his anointed one. And it comes in the form of the royal investiture of his son, the Davidic king. So if you will, turn in your Bibles to Psalm 2. We believe, and good Bible students believe, that this psalm would have been also a coronation psalm, meaning that as a new king came to the Davidic line after the old king died, as a new one came, this would be as part of the coronation ceremony and part of the celebration of that new king coming to the throne. The psalmist writes, "Why are the nations in an uproar and the peoples devising a vain thing?" Again, these are people set in contrast to the nation of Israel. "The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. Let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us." So you feel the tension here between these Gentile nations who don't want to submit to the king of Israel. He who sits in the heavens laughs. This is, of course, talking about God. The Lord scoffs at them. Then he will speak to them in his anger and terrify them in his fury. And this is the Lord speaking. But as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. Now it seems like the king is speaking again in verse 7. This is part of what's a little bit tricky about this psalm is just identifying the speakers in each part. I think the context helps you with that. But the king here says, I will surely tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, Thou art my son, today I have begotten thee. That, again, is a reference to the fact that he has become God's son through his taking of the Davidic throne. Ask of me, and this is the Lord speaking, I will surely give you the nations as thine inheritance, and the very ends of the earth as thy possession. So even though the nations are very much in rebellion against God's nation, Israel, and against her king, he's saying here, it's not going to always be that way. Ask of me, I'll give you the nations as your inheritance. Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron, thou shalt shatter them like earthenware. So there's going to be opposition, but the reign of the Davidic king is going to be of such a character and so strong that he will dominate not only Israel, his own nation, as their king, but all the other nations. And of course, we see that kind of language picked up in the book of Revelation in particular, referring to Christ. And then there's a warning in verses 10 through 12. Now therefore, O kings, show discernment. Take warning, O judges of the earth. I should point out that this psalm is full of Hebrew parallelism, where the second line really says something very similar to the first and just says it in a different way. Worship the Lord with reverence and rejoice with trembling. Do homage to the Son, lest he become angry and you perish in the way. So to worship the Lord was also to honor the Lord's king, the Lord's Son, which was the Davidic king. Do homage to the Son, lest he become angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath may soon be kindled. How blessed are all who take refuge in him. Again, this was something that it was important for them to recognize in their own time, that they were to pay homage to the King of Israel because he was God's anointed. He was serving and reigning on God's behalf on the throne. We know from our perspective in history that the ultimate way that this will be fulfilled and take place is when Christ comes back. It didn't happen at Christ's first coming. The nations, not even his own nation, Israel, gave him proper homage at that time. But in the future, it will happen. And we as we continue to read through the Old Testament, we read the latter prophets, there's a full description of what that reign is going to be like. The reason that we are premillennial is that has not yet happened in history. And when we read about the 1,000-year reign of Christ in Revelation 20, when he comes back, that's when we see the fulfillment of all those prophecies that didn't happen at his first coming. If you're an amillennial, then you're going to try to take those promises in the Old Testament and somehow say that those are all fulfilled in the church today. You really have to spiritualize those promises to make that happen. We believe that just as the curses came upon Israel in a literal fashion in the Old Testament because of their disobedience, that these blessings that will come not only to Israel but to all the nations, that will be very literal as well. And that will only happen when Christ comes back. And it will happen during that 1,000-year reign that's talked about in Revelation 20. All right. We won't take time. Matt already read Psalm 72 for us, so I'm just going to make a few comments here about that passage. By personal example indeed, the Davidic king was to promote righteousness and justice in the land. We read about how he was to take care of the afflicted, to not oppress them. And again, that would be in full accordance with the Mosaic law. He would do this by defending the cause of the afflicted, the weak and helpless, and by crushing their oppressors. The ideal Davidic ruler would occasion the national experience of peace and prosperity. Again, those were blessings that were promised in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy. And international recognition. God promised to give his anointed king dominion over the entire earth. That's very clear, both in what we've looked at already in Psalm 72 and in the prophets. Although this psalm may have been written at the beginning of Solomon's reign, we don't know, we can't tell. We know that Solomon's the one that wrote it. We don't know exactly at what point he wrote it. It envisions ideals never fully realized in Israel's history. Only during the millennial reign of Christ will the peace and prosperity predicted by the psalm find its fulfillment. So again, all these are actually from Gersani's article. In fact, I'm going to send that out to you this week by email, just so you can read all that we've looked at here on the Davidic covenant. Now, Psalm 89 is the one that's the longest and the most obvious reference back to the Davidic covenant. The psalm depicts the psalmist seeking to resolve his belief in God's oath to David on the one hand, and the reality of his own day, which was divine judgment. Now, this psalm evidently was written after they had been exiled, and the psalmist, in this case, it's a guy named Ethan the Ezrahite. He's trying to reconcile in his mind. Okay, on the one hand, God's made these promises to David. We're certainly not seeing the fulfillment of those promises in our day. In fact, we're seeing the fulfillment of the promises or threats, if you want to call them that, of exile. So let's read through this psalm. I'll just make a few comments along the way. It starts off in the first 18 verses as just a recognition and praise for God's lordship, his kingship. I will sing of the loving kindness of the Lord forever. To all generations I will make known thy faithfulness with my mouth. For I have said, loving kindness will be built up forever. In the heavens thou wilt establish thy faithfulness. I have made a covenant with my chosen. I have sworn to David my servant. I will establish your seed forever and build up your throne to all generations. So there is a very explicit reference to the Davidic covenant. He even uses the word covenant here, and that's a word that's not used in 2 Samuel 7. The heavens will praise thy wonders, O Lord, thy faithfulness also in the assembly of the holy ones. For who in the skies is comparable to the Lord? Who among the sons of the mighty is like the Lord? A God greatly feared in the council of the holy ones, and awesome above all those who are around him. O Lord God of hosts, who is like thee, O mighty Lord? Thy faithfulness also surrounds thee. Thou dost rule the swelling of the sea when its waves rise. Thou dost still them. Thou thyself dost crush Rahab like one who is slain. Thou dost scatter thy enemies with thy mighty arm. The heavens are thine, the earth also is thine, the world and all it contains. Thou hast founded them. The north and the south, thou hast created them. Tabor and Hermon, those are two mountains in the land of Israel. Shout for joy at thy name. Thou hast a strong arm, thy hand is mighty, thy right hand is exalted. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of thy throne. Loving kindness and truth go before thee. How blessed are the people who know the joyful sound. O Lord, they walk in the light of thy countenance. In thy name they rejoice all the day, and by thy righteousness they are exalted. He's talking about people that are walking in accordance with the commands as God gave them in the law, and the joy that they experience as they do that. For thou art the glory of their strength, and by thy favor our horn is exalted. For our shield belongs to the Lord, and our King to the Holy One of Israel. All right, as we move into verses 19 to 37, there's more expansion on the Davidic covenant. Once thou didst speak in vision to thy godly ones, and didst say, I have given help to one who is mighty. I have exalted one chosen from the people. I have found David, my servant. With my holy oil I have anointed him. That's why he's called the Messiah. With whom my hand will be established. My arm also will strengthen him. The enemy will not deceive him, nor the son of wickedness afflict him. But I shall crush his adversaries before him and strike those who hate him. Of course, his covenant's made with David. David was a warrior, and he did a tremendous amount to do battle with the enemies of Israel, both those that were still remaining in the land that hadn't been driven out, and others right around them. My faithfulness and my loving kindness will be with him, and in my name his horn will be exalted. I shall also set his hand on the sea and his right hand on the rivers. He will cry to me, Thou art my Father, my God, and the rock of my salvation. You hear the Davidic covenant language in that. I also shall make him my firstborn. And the firstborn in the sense of privilege, of the firstborn of a father, the firstborn son was always the one that got the double blessing. Well, not always. He had made some exceptions to that. But in general, the firstborn was the position of privilege. My loving kindness I will keep for him forever, and my covenant shall be confirmed to him, and I will establish his descendants forever, and his throne as the days of heaven. Hear the 2 Samuel 7 in there as well. If his sons forsake my law and do not walk in my judgments, if they violate my statutes and do not keep my commandments, then I will visit their transgression with the rod and their iniquity with stripes. There's the promise of discipline. But I will not break off my loving kindness from him, nor deal falsely in my faithfulness. My covenant, that is, he would never like a man to sit upon the throne, his line would continue, I will not violate, nor will I alter the utterance of my lips. Once I have sworn by my holiness, I will not lie to David. His descendants shall endure forever, and his throne is the sun before me. It shall be established forever like the moon, and the witness in the sky is faithful. I think Matt read the same thing in Psalm 72, that his throne would endure as long as the moon endured, which is basically forever in the present age.
Is that in context, is they think it's going to last forever, they don't really have any kind of...
Well, they don't have the concept of new heavens, new earth developed as fully as we do. You get to Isaiah, and there is a prediction there of a new heavens, new earth. But yeah, I think that's fair to say that he's recognizing that the security of the Davidic line is as secure as the sun and the moon. It's something they saw every day. So yes, I would say for the most part they don't. They believe that this creation is going to last forever, but I think they also have an idea that it's going to be redeemed as a whole. All right, when you get to verse 38, there's a change in tone here. He's extolled God as the creator, as the one who rules over all things. He's recognized and expounded on the covenant that God has made with David. But now he's trying to, in the form of a lament, he's trying to square up what he sees in front of him with regard to the nation of Israel. And then he's going to make a prayer at the end. But thou hast cast off and rejected. Thou hast been full of wrath against thine anointed. Thou hast spurned the covenant of thy servant. Thou hast profaned his crown in the dust. He's talking about the Davidic king there. Thou hast broken down all his walls. Thou hast brought his strongholds to ruin. All who pass along the way plunder him. He has become a reproach to his neighbors. Thou hast exalted the right hand of his adversaries. Thou hast made all his enemies rejoice. That's interesting, The promises to David were that his enemies would be crushed under his feet, and the same to the nation as they were faithful to obey. Well, God also rules in the hearts of Israel's enemies, and he can use those to discipline Israel. Clearly he did that, both in the case of Babylon and Assyria, as well as other enemies. Thou dost also turn back the edge of his sword, and hast not made him stand in battle. He's talking about his own king, Israel's king there. Thou hast made his splendor to cease, and cast his throne to the ground. Thou hast shortened the days of his youth. Thou hast covered him with shame. And then he starts to ask this question. How long, O Lord? In other words, when are you going to change this? When are you going to intervene and bring about the restoration of Israel? That too was anticipated back in Leviticus 26 and in Deuteronomy. How long, O Lord, wilt thou hide thyself forever? Will thy wrath burn like fire? Remember what my span of life is, for what vanity or brevity of life thou hast created all the sons of men. What man can live and not see death? can he deliver his soul from the power of Sheol? The implied answer to that question is no, he can't. And man's life is but a breath. And he wants this reconciliation to happen in his own lifetime. That's why he's praying the way he's praying. Where are thy former loving kindnesses, O Lord, which thou didst swear to David in thy faithfulness? Remember, O Lord, the reproach of thy servants. How do I bear in my bosom the reproach of all the many peoples, with which thine adversaries have reproached, O Lord, with which they have reproached the footsteps of thine anointed? Blessed be the Lord forever. Amen and amen. So, we talked about this already, but I'll just let you read that quickly. It just summarizes what we've looked at already and the different divisions within that psalm.
When was that psalm written again?
Well, it's hard to know the exact date. And, we can get ideas of the psalms from the superscriptions, the one that have superscriptions right under the psalm number. We know that this one was written by Ethan the Ezrahite. We sense that it was written after they've been cast out of the land. So, but further than that, it's kind of hard to narrow it down. He's still. What's that?
So you think it was like after David and Solomon and all that? Because I always just think of all of these being written by David or Solomon or something.
Yes. So this one actually says that it's written by Ethan the Ezrahite, and most of them are written by David and Solomon, but there's a number that are written, or by David in particular. I think there's only one or two written by Solomon.
I guess I just meant even like the time frame.
Yeah, the time frame varies a lot. If you think about Psalms, it's really a psalm. It's Israel's psalm book, and it is a collection of songs throughout their history. So this one again, I think, would be after they were exiled.
The very next one's written by Moses.
So it's not even in chronological order. There is some division and structure to the book of Psalms. It's divided up into 5 different books, but it covers a long span of time. We'll actually look at that when we get to the Old Testament survey class. We'll talk about these Psalms and the different authors and the fact that they're written over the entire period of Israel's history.
I got a quick question for you. Here in Psalm 89, it separates the first, verse or whatever, but then it says Selah, I think that's how you say it?
Yes.
What is that? I see that all the time in Psalms. What is that?
So I just read the marginal note in my Bible. It's a pause, crescendo, or musical interlude. There's a lot of discussion and debate about what it means, but it seems like a lot of people think that it had to do with how the psalm was sung, and that was a marker in some way of like a stanza marker or something that was maybe a musical interlude that was played at that point during the psalm. Yeah, that is the place it appears is throughout the Psalms. Okay. The psalmist's frustration, as you read it in Psalm 89, demonstrates at least 2 truths. One, that up to this point in Israel's history, whenever it is precisely, the ideal of a just king who would bring the nation lasting peace and prosperity was still unfulfilled. That's really important. It helps you to understand that when Christ came in the New Testament, this is what they were expecting him to do. He came promising the nearness of the kingdom of God. That kingdom, as they understood it, was related back to the Old Testament kingdom. And the fact that their past kings had not been faithful, and their prophets had told them about a coming king who would lead the people in righteousness. When Christ comes and he claims to be that king, then they're looking for the restoration of the nation, first and foremost. And you can understand why. And I think that's what Christ came to do. But they rejected him. And especially the leaders of the nation rejected him. And that caused the leaders of the nation got all the people, well, the biggest majority of them, to call for Christ's crucifixion. So the kingdom itself, as it will be established on the Davidic throne on the earth, is postponed to a future date. And the church comes about for this period in between the first and second coming of Christ. So when you get to the book of Revelation, you've got discussion about the church and the letters to the 7 churches, But then you've got discussion of this tribulation period that's going to precede the actual coming of the king. And when he comes, in Revelation 19 and 20, then he comes and fulfills all these promises by things like the Psalms that have to do with the Davidic dynasty and the latter prophets. Is that clear? Does that make sense? I think that timeline is extremely critical, and we're going to talk about that more when we get to the Old Testament survey class. If you have a good grasp of that storyline as it runs through the Old Testament, then that's going to give you a better understanding when you read the Gospels, when you consider the life of Christ. It's going to help you see how the church and the instruction to the church and the letters fits in within the whole plan of God. It's going to help you understand the book of Revelation. Revelation is a book that has over half of its verses refer back to the Old Testament. So if you get that timeline fixed in your mind, it's not a difficult timeline. It just helps you interpret the Bible no matter what part of it you happen to be in.
Can I ask a question about it?
Yes.
So you were saying about how they were expecting him to do that. Do you think that God made it clear to them that that wasn't what he was going to do? Or do you think that it's kind of like where all the different covenants kind of built on one another, where they didn't have quite as much revelation, and so they just were kind of basing it on just off what they knew? Or do you think they just weren't paying attention? Or do you think, because clearly that just Jesus needed to be rejected and die, but was that just his plan that it worked out that way, or were they just not paying attention when he taught them that? Do you understand my question?
I think so. So I agree that clearly it was God's plan that Jesus would come the first time, be rejected and die. And that was a plan that was established before the foundation of the world. I think that's hinted at and talked about very briefly in the Old Testament. I think Isaiah 53 anticipates his death and his mistreatment. I think Daniel 9 says that after Messiah comes, he will be cut off and have nothing. But if you look at those kinds of instances compared to the majority of what the prophets say, they expect this king to come and to free them from the bondage under which they currently live under the Roman Empire, and to exalt Israel as the nation. I think they are the ones who knew their Old Testament well, rightly expecting him to come and do those things. I think the key issue is that the Pharisees, who really kind of cropped up during the intertestamental period, and I think started out with good intentions. They wanted to put a fence around the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. They really wanted people to obey that section of the Bible. But in the process, they did a lot of bad things, and they started adding on their own teaching and tradition on top of what God's Word said. And when Christ came, they didn't recognize him as the Messiah for different reasons, right? They said, this guy comes out of Galilee, and the prophets don't say that the Messiah is going to come out of Galilee. So I think it was the religious leaders of Israel, and ironically, you would think that they would know better than anybody that Christ was coming in fulfillment of those promises, but they didn't. And in fact, they crucified him. So once again, and you see this in Peter's sermon in Acts 2, you have on the one hand their responsibility in what they did, but on the other hand, it was something that God had foreordained. Mm-hmm. So we have to live with that tension. It's not an easy thing for us to resolve in our own minds, but it was part of the plan of God on the one hand, but they were responsible for what they did on the other.
But you do think kind of that it wasn't quite as clear that was how he was going to come the first time as it would have been for them. They would have seen more of it. This is something different.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's crystal clear. And I think one of the ways that becomes clear is if you look at Christ's ministry himself, for the first 2 years, he doesn't talk about dying. He talks about the nearness of the kingdom. That's what John the Baptist had talked about beforehand. That's what he talked about. That's what he sent the apostles out initially, was to proclaim the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And only as the opposition against him rose over time, over the course of his 3 years, did his message change. It changed first through the parables that he taught, and then very close to his crucifixion, he started talking about the need that he was going to die. And then you see their reaction. This can't be. He's the Messiah. Why would he die? They didn't understand it. It didn't make any sense. So yes, the other thing that you raised was, from where we stand, it's easy for us on this side of the cross to see both things. One, that he is going to come and rule and reign over the earth. Two, that he had to die and die for sin. And it's because we have the additional revelation that it's clear to us. I think it was perfectly legitimate, based on what they had in the Old Testament, for them to expect what they expected. Okay, so up to this point in their history, they haven't had that kind of king. And secondly, the inability of the Davidic rulers to live and rule in accordance with God's demands causes the reader to look forward to a Davidic figure who would one day perfectly satisfy those divine expectations. There's always, I would think for Israel and for us in the church, there's things that we look forward to in the future. And that's what faith is, right? It's believing those things that have not yet come to pass. We believe that Christ will come back and that he will fulfill those prophecies of the Old Testament. And we do have additional revelation, especially in the book of Revelation, that describes that. So we know who that ultimate Davidic king is. He has come once already and died for sin. He now is on the Father's throne in heaven, but he's going to come back and rule from the Davidic throne on earth. That's in this heavens and earth, this present creation, and that leads into the new heavens and new earth. All right, so next week we'll actually look at some more references outside of the Psalms, references in the latter prophets and in the New Testament that again allude back to the Davidic covenant. All right, we've had some good questions already. Is there any other questions or anything that we can clarify on either?
I have one question.
Okay.
At the beginning, the first quote from Dr. Christine, it just kind of sounds like he's saying that they all build on one another. And I'm just wondering, would you say that I think I know what you say, but are they all distinct things, or are they all one where it's kind of like they're all the same covenant that's constantly being renewed and or added onto?
So I think they're distinct things, but the way I would describe it is the Abrahamic covenant it's the most foundational, and it has elements within it that are developed and given more detail in the covenants that build upon it. So it's all one plan and program, but the covenants are different aspects in the unfolding of that plan, if that makes sense. The covenantal theology would say that there is just one covenant of grace, and that all these other covenants are kind of subsumed under that one covenant. I don't think that's the best way to look at it. The idea of a covenant of grace is not in the Scripture anywhere. It's something that they have kind of developed, and it becomes the way that they read the Bible. But to me, you can see these covenants. These are explicit in Scripture, and you can just see how there are different elements of these covenants that tie together. Okay, any other questions? All right, now we'll do the verses.